Hello, and welcome to What's Up With That, a podcast hosted by me, Don Brington. You are here with What's Up With That podcast. We engage in conversations, spiritual, religious, those things that are also relevant for your success. We come to this place and we engage those who are experts in the field, and it's also the place where we can hear diverse conversations and diverse views. So welcome to What's Up With That podcast, and we are ready to go for a delightful evening. On this evening, and I think I've stated in our last podcast that we are doing some things new this season, that we are engaging those things that are theological in nature. And so on this evening, we want to talk about liberation theology. What is it? Is it important? What's the relevance? And to share with us tonight in that conversation is none other than the amazing Reverend Doctor. I think I can safely use that title. The amazing Reverend Doctor Harry Singleton. Now, he has told me that in his hood, where he's from, they say Hank. So he's allowed me to be able to call him Hank on this evening. So Hank, thank you for being with us and glad to have you.
Thank you happy to be here, Brother Brewington. Look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, we spent some time together. Actually, you came in on yesterday, right? You were the I think they call it the E.T. Dixon Lecturer for I think it was their 19th annual E.T. Dixon lecture at Houston Tillotson University. So you were their guest lecturer on today.
Yes.
And had the privilege of hanging out with you, hearing you, as you even on the HT campus today talked about liberation theology, right? So we are so glad that you were able to include me in your time schedule to sit down and have this conversation. And before we get started, I just want to, I've mentioned your name. I've not mentioned much else about you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am a native South Carolinian.
Okay.
So my outlook on life is deeply rooted in Southern culture. And I grew up in the home of a pastor, so I'm a PK.
All right, PK.
They would say both of my parents were educators. Okay. And so it stands to reason, I guess, I was marked even from a little boy that I would grow up and be a theological educator.
Now, you were marked to be an educator, or you were marked to be a theological educator?
I was marked to be a theological educator.
All right, I got you, my brother. Okay.
I thought it would be I would be a historian, particularly as I was a student at the University of South Carolina. And I was taught by the late, great Dean Willie Harriford at the University of South Carolina. And I thought that I would become a historian. He was a model for me in terms of possibly becoming a college professor. But after I saw him, that possibly became probably, and then it became a definite. But it wasn't until after college that I came across a discipline that was simply more irresistible to me than history. And that was theology itself. Even growing up in the home of a pastor, we didn't talk about theology much. Growing up in a small town in South Carolina, you talk about faith and talk about church, and you go to church and you do the churchy thing. Right. But there are not many conversations about theology. And one night my father brought me a book home from his study, as we lived in the parsonage right next door to the church. And he handed it to me and he said, "Read this and tell me what you think about it." And the book stood out because it was an orange book. I'd never seen an orange book before.
It was the color of the book that just made it memorable.
Yeah, as I looked up at it, it was an orange book with black writing on it. And I would come to find out that both of those colors symbolized the meaning that was trying to be conveyed in the book. And so when I got the book and looked at the title of it, it was Black Theology and Black Power written by James Cone, a Black Liberation Theologian who spent 48 years at Union Theological Seminary, considered the father of the modern Black theology movement in the academy. And I stayed up in one sitting and read it until about 3 in the morning. And I was sold after that.
Captivated.
Yes. And then the very next day I read A Black Theology of Liberation.
Okay. And that also a Cone book?
By James Cone as well. Okay. He wrote it a year later. He wrote Black Theology and Black Power in 1969. And as he said, I hit the theological world with a haymaker, and before they could recover from that haymaker, I wanted to hit them with another one, so I wrote A Black Theology of Liberation a year later, as I heard him lecture just a few years after I read the books. And in fact, he did. It ended up being a bombshell in the theological world, in the academy. Yeah,
absolutely.
And that fascinated me more than history. And so I found myself merging the impact of Dean Harrison at the University of South Carolina to become a professor, and reading Cone's work to become a Black liberation theologian. And so you are that Black liberation theologian in your own right. Is that right? That you are academic, that you teach, but you're also author. I am.
The Reverend Dr. Hank Singleton has authored several books. I have 3 of them here in my hand: Forever in Thy Path, The God of Black Liberation.
My latest.
This is your latest?
Yes.
Okay, wow. Well, I made a purchase today. And so I'm going to, I've dived into some of Cone. Of course, some would say even that Howard Thurman was potentially an early liberation theologian, right?
Yes.
African American. So I have looked at some of those, but guess who I'm going to dive into now? I'm going to dive into Dr. Harry H. Singleton. And this is new, the third, okay? But yes, and going to encourage others. We're going to get better. At some point, I wish we could download it or put it somewhere where you could get it. But the title of the books are Harry H. Singleton the Third. He's the author. Forever in Thy Path, The God of Black Liberation, White Religion, and Black Humanity. Sounds interesting. And then there is Divine Revelation and Human Liberation. We also have one on the desk over there, and I believe that's one where you actually talk about James Cone.
Yes.
And his...
Yes, in fact, his picture adorns the front of the book. It started as my dissertation in grad school on the theology of James Cone and Latin American liberation theologian Juan Luis Segundo. On theological method, the methodology of what it means to do theology and write theology. And so from an honorific standpoint, as I even got a chance to say to him in 1997 in San Francisco at the American Academy of Religion annual meeting, that I wanted to thank him for giving me a thinker with which to do my dissertation, with which to structure my career going forward. He didn't have that coming along in the 1960s because there were no Black theologians in the academy at that time. And so I thanked him for it. He had to do his dissertation on Karl Barth's Doctrine of Humanity, who was one of the major towering figures in the 20th century. Some consider him the greatest of the 20th century. And of course, he had to read Barth thoroughly when he was a doctoral student, but he had no Black theologian with which to do his work, and so he was extremely grateful that I'd chosen him. And of course, it was fun writing the book, to have his books and articles all over my apartment in Berkeley, California, when I was a student and working on it. And worked on it for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. But it was not work.
It's called commitment, too.
Yeah,
it's called commitment and obviously a passion.
Yes, a labor of love. And I felt empowered knowing that I was headed in his direction, and not just in his direction, but of all of the Black authors who've tried to make sense out of our reality and tried to inspire and raise the consciousness of Black people, and whoever other people would listen to their works. James Baldwin, certainly. Audre Lorde, certainly. Rayford Logan, certainly. Naeem Akbar. Just a long list of Black authors.
And those are names that you probably come back to and throw out as about liberation theology. I had the privilege of, I guess I've met James Cone, but he wouldn't know me from Adam, right? Had the privilege of attending Church World Service event in D.C. some years ago in seminary. I did an intern at God Bank, Riverside, back then when it was really popular. And he was amazing. He was amazing. Actually, he was amazing how he cut up some folk of the lighter hue. Initially, I mean, he spoke truth. And I remember one woman, and we ate lunch and dinner together often. She was, I don't know why they're getting so upset at Dr. Cone. He's just speaking the truth. Yes. And one evening he began to talk about missionaries in foreign lands. Yes. And we got to dinner. That man, her total tone and everything. It just that man, Muffy, calm down, okay? It may not be you. But also, when we talk about and I'm sure we will move there. Racism, systematic racism, wherever it falls. That sometimes we're not engaging per se, but when you don't use your voice to speak up against it, there also is a ramification there, right? Because if I know that there's a better way, that I'm called to say something, I think. But it was delightful. It was great. I remember Muffy's reaction. I mean, more than I remember James Cone, because I mean, it was great, and she was just all into it, and all of a sudden, this man. But anyway, delightful person. Yes. So we're talking about liberation theology. For a lot of us in churches every week, have been in church for years, haven't really heard of liberation theology. So just off the cuff, want to just start off with, what is liberation theology?
Well, liberation theology is actually a school of thought that emerged in the academy with James Cone's publication of Black Theology and Black Power. But at the same time, too, liberation theology is not a theology that emerged thoroughly in the life of the church. It really emerged in the streets. It emerged in city halls. It emerged in council chambers as a means of incorporating divine reality into the Black struggle for justice, for freedom, and freedom and self-determination. Okay,
you say for the purpose of inputting divine reality into this world that we. What do you mean?
Right. That the struggle for human beings in an oppressive context, as Black people have found themselves, to find vehicles with which to express their humanity in a nation that has said to them, generation in, generation out, that they are not human beings, or if they are human beings, they're not human beings on the level of white people. Brings us to the encounter for African Americans with God's self, and how African Americans have understood themselves to be viewed by God, despite the denunciations of this nation and society of Black humanity, done primarily to make Black people think that their suffering was ordained of God so that they could continue to be exploited for cheap labor, beginning with the slave trade, and even in post-slavery with, of course, tenant farming and sharecropping. That we were brought to this country as pawns of cheap labor by European planters, with the expectation that that institution would last for a lifetime. And so as we move through American history, and we've seen denunciations in and out, 3/5 of a person, minstrel shows, castrations, lynchings, lack of due process, lack of justice and the right to vote in the courts. In every arena of American life, African Americans have been looked upon as less than, as second-class citizens. And so the attempt to then look at God as the basis by which we affirm our humanity against those encroachments on our humanity is the basis by which Black theology emerges, because it then gives us a source and a vehicle with which to say to the nation and the world that regardless of what you say about us, regardless of what your politicians create in terms of laws that hamstring our advancement, we will continue to see ourselves as children of God that are worthy of the blessings of God and worthy to share the resources of this earth. And so Black theology gives us a vehicle with which to express that discontent and even that rage with what we have been made, but at the same time to announce to the white power structure that the good news of the gospel compels us to fight against those denunciations.
That's good. Part of me wants to, is a question that was really rolling in my mind as we look at what I'm hearing, a way of looking at canon, Bible, gospel, that shares us, that shows us as a people, as God sees us, and not as the world or those who would seek to oppress us. Can we put a pin there for a second?
Sure.
Because I want to ask, as we talk about liberation theology, and I think it's important that we really dig into Black theology, but as we talk about liberation theology, is it restricted to Blackness? Are there other forms of liberation theology? Well, I'm going to say there are. Are there other forms of liberation theology? You have Latin American liberation theology, right?
Yes.
Hoping, you one of your colleagues is a forerunner in the womanist movement, right? And that is an expression out of the oppression of women, and more specifically Black women. Is that right?
Yes.
Or women of color.
Womanism, yes, absolutely.
Whereas the feminist.
To be contrasted with feminism.
Yeah, right. So it's fair to say that as we look at liberation theology, we are looking at it from various perspectives.
Right.
Right. Why is it important that we view and really want to well, if we can roll back, but why is it important that we even take the time to call this thing a liberation theology and look at it from a Black lens? I'm going to say I remember for me that was difficult, right? Family, I grew up military background, family military. We did some traveling growing up, right? Lived in various places, early age and as old as I am, we went to military bases, so integrated schools, right? I found myself at my first HBCU, which was a seminary, which was ITC. My first, right? High school was all mixed. Elementary school was all mixed all my life, right? I found myself at this Black seminary, and they kept talking about liberation theology, Black theology, and my construct where I come from, and maybe it's somebody else's too. I don't know. Help us understand. Was why are they doing that? God is God, and your color doesn't matter, right?
Right.
It was in a sociology of religion class, and the instructor was talking, and she was engaging. Can't remember the exact conversation, but it was in that moment. You called it something like that, but that aha moment, that aha
the light
moment,
comes on.
Yeah. Where I get this. I get this. Why do we need a liberation theology? And are you, as you seek to construct this theology towards, and not just Black, but liberation, all of these oppressed groups, what's up with that?
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you said oppressed groups. The reality is that most of us in society are socialized to see religion as a universal phenomenon, that humans are humans and God is God. And that we're all one humanity that was created by one God. But the unfolding of history in terms of the sharing of the resources of the earth has reflected just the opposite of that. Because of the European man's quest to conquer not only lower animals but other human beings, you see Black people, other people of color in South America, in present-day Latin America. You see both Black and white women, or women in general, also ostracized and relegated to second-class citizenship from a sexist standpoint.
Yeah.
And so we have encountered a society where, even though we have been taught from an altruistic standpoint that we're all the same, we haven't been treated the same. And so theology has been a controversial phenomenon because it is contextual in nature. That
when you say theology has been controversial because it's contextual in nature,
yes.
What do you mean?
It means that each of these groups experience a unique type of oppression.
Okay.
The oppression that black people
women,
experience from a racial standpoint
Latin American
is different from what white women experience, what black women experience, and what people in Latin America experience. They're all manifestations or mutations of oppression, but they differ because of the laws, because of the particular impositions on their humanity. And so each one of these groups feels it necessary to contextualize their struggle so that they can write in such an exclusive way to bring ultimate attention to their particular condition. It doesn't mean that it is the only oppressive condition, but it does mean that the people who are writing out of that condition have suffered within the context of that condition and therefore are best qualified to write about it and to articulate it publicly. So whether it's black theology as it relates to black people and race in America, whether it's womanist theology, as it relates to the unique experience of black women's oppression, starting on the plantation and coming forward today, whether it's white women and the feminist movement and the oppressive relationships that they've had interacting and structurally and personally, even with their own white men, the reality is that each of these manifestations represent schools of liberation theology because they operate out of an oppressed context. And of course, the bookend or handmaiden to oppression is its polar opposite, which is liberation.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I was hearing all of that, and it sounds really great, right? I would venture to say that perhaps there are some who would say, that's great. So what we are understanding is that whether you are black, whether you are white woman, whether you are black woman, whether you are Hispanic, Latin American, in that category, that we all got problems. And I understand you writing about our context and in those situations because our stories must be shared. But when we talk about theology, and within the kind of folk, and I'm gonna say of my folk, black folk, we talking Bible.
The Bible says.
We don't Bible. So how does God fit into all these? Does he fit into all of them? And I'm not sure if you're saying that he fits into all of them, and out of all of them that we must then interpret how that applies to my context.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because God emerges in context. The encounter with God emerges in context.
Okay.
And so the context of black men presents a context. So encounter with God is uniquely theirs. For black people, racially, their encounter with God is different. For white women, their encounter with God is different because we are not all treated the same and we don't all have the same issues. That in this case, they emerge out of a context of systemic denial of basic rights, justice due in the courts in terms of the humanity and the presentation and their depiction to larger society, and of course how they have been exploited in the larger society, namely because of their race and because of their gender, and for poor people, their class as well. And so the manifestation of oppression means that we have experienced oppression in different ways, which means that we don't all live the same. Okay. Because that's more of a misnomer that emerges out of a European context, trying to level the playing field ideologically while keeping a hierarchical understanding of the races and the endowment of humanity from a pragmatic standpoint. And that is what liberation theology is designed to do. It is designed to engage in analysis of that hierarchy in light of the fact that we are presented with this universal theology that has been used as a clever ruse to divert these groups' attention away from their suffering, we must keep in mind, too, that the Bible, as we said, itself is not a universal book.
So what are you saying?
The Bible itself, it chronicles God's relationship with a particular people, and that is the Israelites.
Okay.
That it's really a sacred history book that chronicles God's relationships, i.e. their encounter with God in light of the experiences that they suffer. So even as we talk about the universalism from an ideological standpoint of all humans at least being created by God, the reality is that we're all not treated the same way by other human beings, which then creates unique encounters with God based on the manifestations of that mistreatment.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out a way to phrase this. You said a lot there, right? You said a whole lot in terms of European. Part of me wants to say, why European than just white? Than just white. The other is 500 questions at one time. So shoot them down and say, back them up. Because you got too many at one time. Let's take one at a time, right?
You want to talk with European? Talk about European?
The European was also struck by your comment in terms of the Bible. It's contextual. Inviting you to say more, and then what does, as you say the more there, what does that mean as you move forward and become inclusive, where you say it was contextual to an Israelite people, that now becomes inclusive of all faith groups, of all peoples?
Well, theologically, as long as you're dealing with an oppressive context, then the universalism entails, how do you find your place in that struggle? How do you identify with black people in their struggle racially? How do you identify with black women in their struggle racially? How do you identify with women in general racially? It's the universalism does not come in denying the reality of systemic oppression. The universalism comes in how can I help change this condition, which is not a part of our contemporary dialogue about liberation theology and about how faith should be lived.
Okay.
That faith is lived as we are taught in a more personal way, and not how we can make a direct contribution to changing the reality of these relationships so that they do reflect more of an equality or an egalitarian reality universally.
Some of the other folk will say, so that we can live in this world that God has called us to.
One nation under God.
And all be together and it all be okay.
With liberty and justice for all.
And so the piece of that then is I want to make a statement, but in some ways I want to ask a question too. That piece in liberation theology, the value, is perhaps when we understand that it's liberation because it's this thing that we call faith is relational. And what I'm hearing in the conversations is relationships are off. Relationally, I'm not treating you right. Right? So relationships are not what relationships ought to be. That this thing that we profess, this faith we profess, is something that is relational. I heard you say today that too often we want to individualize it, right? But if we're true to the faith tradition, it has to be relational. And because if it's relational, it's the only way that I can see the oppression. Only way that I can see the unfair treatment. Right? And not only see it, but do more than pray about it.
Well, and that's why theology is so important, because theology is to help the believer understand that a true faith expressed is a faith that is contributory to changing those relationships. If we think about it within the context of the religious individual, then it is the task of theologians to make you see the other dimension, to make you see the collective dimension, to make you see the systemic dimension, namely because it's the context that you have inherited, and in light of that, causes human beings, because of that systemic reality, to live lives that are unfulfilled, and it shatters dreams and aspirations because of that. So in light of that, the theologian's task is to engage in a contemporary discourse that challenges the way we have been taught to understand faith, because, as you said, we have been taught to understand faith in purely personal means, but there's a collective dimension. Again, the Exodus narrative in the Bible is about a people leaving slavery and going to freedom at God's behest, with God sending Moses to Pharaoh saying, it's time to let my people go, and only sending with a rod and a promissory note. And so we can't ignore these narratives, even for the Bible-toting Christians who want to talk within the context and live faith within the context conveniently, particularly for many white Americans, within the context of the religious individual, in the process of trying to deny the reality of not only racism, but their privileged status because of generations of racial antagonisms and racial hegemony heaped on people of color. And so the task of the theologian is to not allow us to engage in an easy affinity between interior living and the life of faith exclusively. That the theologian is compelled to push the believer to see not only his or her place in the faith experience personally, but to see her or himself in the faith experience collectively as well. Okay,
can you break down for us a little bit the interior? You talk about.
Yeah, when I mean interior, we talk about the interior in terms of inside the body from a spiritual standpoint. That we have been taught to think that religion deals mainly with interior issues of the religious individual, and spiritual issues. Miracles within the context of, regaining health per se, and not miracles within the context of a people moving from slavery to freedom. In other words, Black people being emancipated, at least from the institution of slavery, should be looked upon theologically just as miraculous as a loved one's cancer going into remission. But we have not been taught to equate the former with theology and subsequently with faith, only the latter in terms of cancer going into remission. And so the task of the theologian is to expand the understanding of faith so that it does incorporate the collective dimension of body politic and the ultimate destiny of people, of collectively, of communities in human history. And the conversation becomes more critical when we look at the history of this country and look at how white Christian ministers actually use biblical revelation and that understanding of theology, that interior understanding of theology, to divert Black people's energies away from their earthly suffering and what God has to say about that suffering.
Okay. So what is the place? And I'm hearing that, and I'm hearing the general. I'm hearing liberation theology. I'm hearing looks beyond just the salvific. Oh, I'm saved. I'm living this life so I can go to heaven. Right?
Absolutely.
But that it's more than that. That it's a gospel. It's a word. So that all humanity have the potential to inherit the kingdom, and that's probably, I'm going a little bit super religious there, right? But that place where there is a level playing field, there is, and I'm almost to a point now where I prefer for that we are equitable and not equal. I'm not so concerned about being equal as I am about being equitable, and all things are equitable, and there's equity, right? But in that, and I want to come back to Black theology, in that calls for us to interpret. What would you say for those, and it's all good stuff, right?
Right.
That the gospel's here, and liberation theology helps to liberate us from those oppressive states that we find ourselves in, right? But that calls for interpretation even within your own context, black, brown, white, right? Is it okay to engage in interpretation? Are you not supposed to, as some would say, the word says, this is what the word says, and you don't change it, this is what the word says. And so with that, sometimes can't find that place of incorporating, sort of like my experience, right? I don't get this black theology thing, right? God, I know, says, and when you begin to interpret, then are you twisting the words that you find in Scripture? Are you making them fit what you want to fit? What's happening behind that?
No, I'm not making it fit. The reality is that the Bible is an interpretational book.
Okay.
Namely because we're dealing with a context from 2,000 years ago. And we find ourselves in a different geographical area in the world in 2,000 years later. And the world that we were born into is vastly different than the one of first century Palestine that Jesus inherited, or even the one that Moses inherited. And so it requires you raising the question, what does that mean for our time? And whether you realize you are doing that or not, you are actually doing it. And so I know evangelicals live with the motto, the Bible said it, I believe it, and that settles it. But the reality is that you are engaged in a theology, and historically you have been engaged in a theology of acute individualism, of rugged individualism, of the religious individual, which of course fit well from a rule standpoint, an ideological standpoint, your collective human domination of black people in the slave trade and since the slave trade. And so in that sense, it meant conveniently that the Bible gets interpreted in such a way that we will ignore the Exodus narrative, that we will ignore the social rage of the prophets, that we would ignore God actually coming in Jesus to a poor and despised people and saying to his home church, I came to set at liberty those who are oppressed. That we tend to forget these narratives conveniently because they fall out of the purview of what we are trying to accomplish in perpetuating these systemic relationships of oppression for economic gain. And so in that sense, you are engaged in a theology and an oppressive theology that doesn't interpret these texts, but conveniently leaves them out of the hermeneutical equation, as we would call it.
So then the call then is for liberation theologians is to call to remembrance those verses.
Absolutely.
And to articulate that they will not be forgotten.
Well, to enter them in a public conversation.
Okay. All right. So that they will not be forgotten, and this is very much part of, and let's take out what was dealt with, and this is something that we must deal with here now.
Absolutely.
Perhaps, and if we can swing into black theology, is that maybe some of the premise? There are those who were slaves and coming out of slavery would not engage with some of the writings of Brother Paul. Right, some of the passages in terms of slavery, slaves obey your master.
Yeah.
Okay, that you had some folk who understood, who were smart enough to understood the contradictions.
Absolutely.
That came out of the mouth of Paul.
Absolutely.
Right? Paul is not one of my most favorite persons, right? But the contradictions that comes out of the mouth of Paul, be good to your master, and even if he's cruel to you, do it anyway, because you'll get your reward in heaven. You can't beat me down here.
Absolutely.
So as we talk about that, and a black theology, Your views. Is there a call to? Is there a responsibility of those who share gospel to, in some way, on some level, somehow engage in liberation theology?
I dare not presume to speak for all liberation theologians.
Okay.
But I think I can when I say we certainly have a love-hate relationship with Paul.
Okay.
He's considered the most significant character in the Bible beyond Jesus. On the one hand, you do get these references to slavery, which really it's been interpreted slavery in contemporary English translations. It's really servant. It really means servant and not slavery. But you also get, Paul saying to the church at Galatia, who was more concerned about circumcision than they were about human freedom, when he says in Galatians 5:1 that, never again submit yourselves to a yoke of slavery. Mm-hmm. And so the question then becomes, which do you use the Titus passage where you taught, if he treats your slave master treats you cruel, then, or do you use the Galatians 5? It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Never again submit yourselves to a yoke of slavery. And what it really reveals for me as I deal with Paul is that Paul was contextual in his writing. Mm-hmm. Okay. That the issues in Titus or Timothy, before he handed the reins over to Timothy, mm-hmm. were not the same ones at the church at Corinth or the church at Galatia. So he's writing about different issues in different contexts. Okay. But to your point, the system of servanthood in first century Palestine was in no way, shape, or form like the chattel racial slavery that black people encountered when they were kidnapped from Africa. And so in terms of the branding, the auction blocks, mm-hmm. the whippings, the breaking up of the families, this was never the type of servanthood system that Paul had encountered, and certainly not the type of servanthood that Jesus had encountered. But again, the task of the theologian is to bring all of the dimensions of that conversation to bear, because, of course, in many ways in our religious institutions, we operate out of this, this pedagogical tool where if I tell you something that you should believe it as a faithful parishioner. And so we've had to listen to sermons, speaking of those slaves, generation in, generation out, who talked up the virtues of slavery using those passages, when in essence we have to deal with servanthood within the context of Paul dealing with slavery as a moral issue, yes, but certainly as an issue in which, depending on which context you find Paul in which church
you find
Paul is dealing with them and taking angles with them based on the problems he has encountered in that particular church. And again, the task of the theologian is to bring those angles to bear. But at the end of the day, too, we have to take into consideration that as we are 2,000 years removed from that, in the name of the God that created us, what in essence does human decency look like? Okay. What does it mean to be decent? What does it mean to be in order? Do unto others as you would have others done to you. That's the golden rule. Are white folks saying to us with their treatment of us historically that, yeah, we want to be treated the way we treat y'all? I don't think so. Okay. And so when you look at the golden rule itself from a theological and biblical standpoint, it finds itself grossly incompatible with the attempt to enslave people and subject them to the harshest forms of physical and psychical abuse in the past half millennium. Okay. And no less to use biblical interpretation as the basis for getting them to think that this is somehow ordained of God. Malcolm X said that the greatest thing, the worst thing that the white man taught us was to hate ourselves. I don't know if I fully agree with that, although it has its place in the conversation. I think the worst thing the white man taught us is to think that our enslavement was divinely ordained of God. Okay. Because it created this huge dilemma, existential, ontological with slaves, as to, on the one hand, intuiting that what they were experiencing was ungodly, and at the other hand, being taught that if they tried to change their condition, they were engaged in the highest sin because God had ordained their enslavement. That created an existential dilemma that I still think is imprinted heavily on the social and historical DNA of black people even today.
And some of that was survival, and some forms of survival.
Absolutely.
We talk about how some black families, and we're seeing some large shifts, but especially lower income environments, others, and even others, right? Because I mean, we are still, I think I heard you say today, and today it is even more imperative and relevant for us to engage in black theology. A day and time when, if we're going to send our kids out, we've got to talk a certain way, right? Because we want them to come back alive.
Well, yeah.
And some of that conversation stems from, I might be wrong, you are the scholar.
Well, the danger
stems from the danger and the dangers that were heaped on them coming through slavery, out of slavery.
Well, it was the 1860s.
What are you going to have to do to stay alive?
Right, 1860s, and 1960s, 2025. You know, whether it's the police, whether it's the Ku Klux Klan, whether it's the slaveholder.
So there's some things going on, and would you say that in some of that we are not even aware? That keeps us from moving into the realm of understanding and embracing liberation theology, a theology that speaks to a specific community in context, right?
Well, and I think that's why theology is important, because white people don't experience what we experience, and therefore their encounter with God is different from our experience. And to some degree, as this conversation proceeds, there's a real sense in which I really don't expect most white Americans to understand where black people are coming from. Well, and I don't expect them to, because it's so foreign to them, because from an experiential standpoint, they can't relate to it. They can't relate to what it's like to almost urinate in your pants when you're pulled over at the side of, because this could be your last breath. I mean, as you encounter this white police officer, whether it's a white police officer, now, whether it's, a Ku Klux Klansman in the 60s, whether it was a slaveholder in the 1860s, there's always been this encounter with death. That's
encounter with death. That's serious, right? That's serious.
White people have not really had to relate to. As a result of their history as an oppressing community, and not those who have been the recipients of that treatment. My father used to say all the time that Muhammad Ali was never the expert on how his punches felt. That in order for us to find out how Muhammad Ali's punches felt, we would need to ask Joe Frazier. We would need to ask Ken Norton. We would need to ask Leon Spinks. To ask white people to talk definitively about racism is like asking Muhammad Ali to talk definitively about how his punch felt. At best, he could say how good it felt when it landed, but he is not in an authority to talk about the impact.
He's not experienced it.
He has not experienced it, and so as a result of that, white people are less qualified to speak about oppressive conditions that they have created, and at the same time try to maintain that they are far more benign than what black people are saying. But when you look at poverty rates, when you look at rates of disillusionment, when you look at the implosion on the black community, particularly with young black men even, you see from a sociological standpoint of people who have had to live generation in and generation out with this vicious cycle of poverty, but more importantly, this vicious cycle of anti-black animus. And so just because the white-only signs have gone down, just because the crosses are not burnt in yards anymore, just because police are not coming to pull you out of your house at midnight because you drank from the white water fountain, doesn't mean that racism is no less virulent today as it manifests itself in what is becoming an increasingly more hostile and overt environment.
There's a need. You keep talking. You keep raising that word, theology. And they are not aware of the theological. What's the difference between theology and me getting my Bible and reading it and say, okay, now this is what God says. Which of us are being true to Scripture?
Well, I think that as we unpack that question, I think that ultimately theology forces us to talk about divine encounter out of our comfort zone or out of our traditional zone. That it is designed to make us consider other factors relative to encounter. And that's theology's greatest gift to this conversation about faith and about religion. There is a sense in which all of us are theologians. Like you said, people can read the Bible and say, this is the biblical approach I want to take. But they have been taught because of orthodoxy that it's not an approach. But all approaches are approaches to biblical interpretation and encounter with God. There's no such thing as this universal pure approach that we have been taught exists in the church. And so in that sense, even though they don't realize it, churches do have a theology. Deacons have a theology. Pastors have a theology. A denomination has a theology. And so whether they want to recognize it or not, they do, but they don't want to recognize it because they're trying to style it as the approach that God finds pleasing to all other approaches.
So what did you mean? I'll come back, but just quickly, you said, you talked about the approaches, and it's more than just the universal pure, use the word pure approach. And I guess for those who want to see Bible and take it literally.
Absolutely.
In all instances, again, notwithstanding that it's 2,000 years later.
Yes.
Right.
Different context, different geographical area of the world.
So when you say pure, what do you mean?
That, as you mentioned earlier, that particularly in the neo-evangelical sense, that the Bible is an infallible book, that it's a perfect book as has been taught by many evangelicals, and that it needs no interpretation, which really begs the question, particularly in terms of not only content, because the Bible is really not a book. It's 66 different books written at different times by 40 different authors, which makes it in and of itself contextual. And again, that's where theology comes in, because in churches we are taught that it's one book, and in some cases that God empowered 3 or 4 human beings to transcend their imperfections and perfectly transcribe the book to try to make the infallibility of the Bible jibe with their original assertion. They do what I refer to as backing themselves in a theological corner. Because if you acknowledge that God did not write the Bible, as I tell my students, that God did not sit down at a desk and write the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and 20,000 years ago came by in some type of helicopter or something and threw the Bible down on the ground, and the people who were living at that time grabbed it and read it and said, this is the way God wants us to live. That there's no such animal. And even evangelicals have to recognize that. So the way they've gotten around after asserting presupposition-wise that the Bible is an infallible, i.e. perfect book, is how can we make this now sound reasonable, even with our recognition that God did not sit down and write the Bible perfectly. And so their theory is that God commissioned 3 writers and caused them to that God commissioned writers to get them to and transcended their human nature, their sinful nature, to make them perfect in the spirit, so that they could write this perfect book, because he loved humanity that much that he did that for these few human beings who ended up writing the Bible. Again, couldn't be further from the truth. The contextual nature of the Bible itself has been found to be true historically, and has been found to be true in terms of the Bible as a book and the formation of both Old and New Testament canons as well. And so no, 3 men did not write the Bible at the same time and wrote this perfect book. Again, it was written in different eras, it was written in different contexts, and it was written at different times in the evolving of world history.
Yeah. And we will be doing a segment on the canon, right? How did this canon, this book called Bible, come into existence?
Yes.
So to engage in theological conversations, to understand that there is this thing they call liberation theology, to understand, and I'm hoping that my viewers are diverse, but I do have a word for those who look like me, right? I have a heart for everybody. We all say that. I said that somebody. I hope that doesn't sound racist, right? The classical racist statement. I love everybody, but I would hope that there is a conversation to be had for our Black, our African American brothers and sisters who hopefully will tune into this podcast and spend some time with us.
Right.
So as we look at theology, liberation theology, it's not a twisting of the text. It's understanding that wherever we come from, it's our context. That as we look at, there was a young man who was enamored. You got to know that Dr. Singleton is amazing, and he touched some of I retired from HT, so it's not our anymore, right? He touched some of the students at HT in a phenomenal way. One young man in particular. We were engaging in conversation in that piece of looking at context, right? I am sometimes challenged. How we as a Black people can scrutinize some of our preachers, and some of them may be deserving, but certainly not all. And around money, around giving, around some teaching, can go to a dominant church, white church, and they're saying the same thing, different way, contextualizing it so it's okay for them, and we fall in line. Some of them will have the same airplane, driving bigger cars.
Absolutely.
And we're gonna give, but we will upload and log into their context, negating our own. Is there an injustice in doing that?
Well, not only is it an injustice, in my judgment, it's a travesty.
Okay.
And it's a travesty because of theology.
Got back to that word again. Got that word again. That theology thing. All right. Go ahead and say more. Go ahead and say more.
Namely because, one unfortunate aspect of our oppressive encounter is that we have been taught to look at white people as superior to us.
Okay.
And white men have created a nation that pragmatically suggests that. Looking at his wealth, looking at his power, looking at his occupying of the major decision-making positions and owning the major and most popular businesses in American life, particularly businesses that relate to human need, clothes, cars, food, shelter, real estate industry. You generally see a white man at the head of it and making the most money. And so this feeds into the notion of Black people, well, if he has all of this, then it must mean that he is superior. And that if I am going to eke out an existence in America better than what I have historically encountered, then my best option is to listen to him.
Yeah.
And believe, more importantly, unfortunately, that what he's saying to me has a legitimacy to it. That is not the case when somebody Black says it to me. And in predominantly white denominations, that for years now there has been a huge problem with cross-racial appointments.
Oh, within
and I'm not going. Yes, and some denominations. Yeah, some of the connectional churches. Yeah. And this has been going on since the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
In connectional churches, wherein when the bishop appoints a black person to pastor a predominantly white local congregation,
they're gonna be there wrong.
Oh, they leave en masse. I can't sit there and listen to this Negro preach to me every Sunday.
If you come visit,
after all, he's black.
And if you come visit, we love it.
Yes.
But if you come to stay and pastor us,
and it's bad enough he's getting the accoutrements of being a leader in this denomination, but we have to sit and listen to him or her every Sunday. Oh no, I don't think so. They leave and go to churches that are pastored by white, namely white males. Mm-hmm. But when a white pastor has been appointed to a predominantly black church, not only do they not leave, but they engage in this blissful glee and begin to invite even some of their friends to come to their churches to hear this new pastor.
When they never invited him before.
To sit at his feet and listen to him, because he's so sensible and he handles his manuscript and the text very well, and he's really just a great preacher and a great teacher from the pulpit. We get excited. We cannot divorce that racial discrepancy from the history of this country relative to racial superiority and inferiority theories with reference to white and black people.
Okay, break that down.
That we can't divorce this from our being taught as black people that white people are superior, that their intellect is superior, that they are more physically superior, and that culturally their expressions are more superior. That from a business standpoint, their products are better than the products that are made from a black business. As the old folks say, we think that the white man's ice is cooler and his bread is tastier. And so all of that is the result of centuries of being taught that white people are superior. And as it relates to the theological aspect of it, not only is this a falling away from the humanity with which God created us, but when you take a Christian symbol like Jesus Christ and make him white in image, and present that image to both white and black people, surely it can only have one result. It will make white people think that they are superior, and it will make people of color think that they are inferior. And then solidify in black people's minds that since Jesus is white, that must mean that white people are superior to us as black people. And so Jesus' divinity lies not in his ministry, but Jesus' divinity lies in his whiteness. And so that must mean that divinity lies in the people in whom Jesus shares his image, and that's white people. And that owes it, and that's why we have this, discrepancy relative to the way white and black humanity is viewed relative to their ultimate value in human worth.
Which then makes liberation theology, i.e., black theology, relevant, appropriate, and necessary.
Absolutely. In this context, and
especially today,
because of the systemic nature of the context of oppression we have inherited, it makes liberation, which is the polar opposite of oppression, the crucial principle of interpretation by which we must understand biblical revelation. If not, then all is lost. Black people continue to remain inferior in their minds throughout eternity. White people continue to treat them as inferiors throughout eternity. And then you have this cleavage racially that has characterized the history of this country. Not only is it an ungodly interaction, but it's also a deadly interaction, an unfulfilled interaction for black people.
Okay. So how do we help those who do not see, maybe have challenges perceiving? Certainly I did, right? I mean, it was my second or third semester in seminary when I got to sociology of religion. And they was walking around this place talking about black theology. What's up? God is for everybody. You know what I mean? And it was in that sociology religion class. I will always remember that I had my aha moment. I think I heard you say today in your lecture that at some point in life we all have an aha moment. How do we help our folk come into that aha moment and, if nothing else, appreciate the role and place? First of all, understanding it, because I think there are a lot of folk who really don't understand this thing that theologians like to talk about in terms of liberation theology, right? So one, how do we get them to understand it and at least begin the process of embracing? Churches, our communities have been gentrified, right? They're not being, they have been gentrified. They continue to be. Communities that were once black and brown are now white with a black church there. And they pass by it. One or two may come in. Now, how long they stay? For the greater part, I'm impressed at my church right now. We have, I don't go like I should go, so have a couple of white deacons. One's married to a black woman. Okay. The other's a white family, and they're there, and they've been there consistently, but that's not the norm. In demonstration, that's not the norm, because a lot of white folk in the community, and I'm not sure if they're from the community or if they drive in, but they're staying. The others are not. They come in, pass through. Some might come in thinking it was a white church, and they can't wait to get out the door. Right. But to understand, and how do we help folk to understand the place, the necessity of a black theology, with the mindset of we're not compromising, we're not trying to make the gospel, i.e. God's word, fit into something that was not meant to fit in, but that somewhere this gospel that we talk about, this Bible that we talk about, has to have the theological associated with it, right? And not just from
inescapably
a white Anglican perspective, because what we have been taught, and a lot of what we continue to teach, is from a white Anglican perspective.
Absolutely.
Right? And so, and I keep asking, I'm going to be quiet, how do we help others?
Not at all.
Understand it, understand the importance, the necessity, and that it's not compromising the gospel. It's not twisting it. It's not trying to alter it. It's taking that gospel, making it real, looking at life applications, understanding. 66 books written in different situations for different reasons. Things were happening. It had to be addressed here. They began to share the letters, but they were written. How do we do that?
Well, let's start biblically and work back since you went there.
Okay.
The reality is that the Bible itself is not for everybody.
Whoa, that's a hard one.
Let me explain that.
Okay.
God is for everybody in a perfect world. Okay. But when that world becomes imperfect, that it's characterized by oppressive relationships, where does God turn God's attention? If we look at the Exodus narrative, God turns God's attention not only to the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt, but God turns God's self to taking and being partial and taking sides. Taking the side of the Israelites. Not sending Moses to Egypt to tell Pharaoh, you're doing a great job. Oppress him for another 400 years. All right. He sends Moses to tell Pharaoh his time is up. And so we're dealing with a God that identifies with those who have been the victims of acute mistreatment from other human beings. Jesus' identification as God becomes human in Jesus. God decides to incarnate God's self to a despised people and a poor people. Certainly we see that now with now president who was a candidate vilifying immigrants, still deporting them, saying that they're eating dogs and referring to jobs of menial labor and civil servants as black jobs.
Okay.
And so you see this callous insensitivity emerge out of a superior consciousness. Even in the gentrification example you just raised, as the machine of white supremacy rolls on, whatever ideas they come up with, particularly in regard to expanding their economic base. Does anyone ever ask the question, what happened to those black people who used to live in those houses?
Well.
What happens to the people who have no voice? What happens to the people who have been put out of their homes, who are now homeless because of that gentrification process? The reality is we are taught, and here's the Bible and theology again, to be a voice for those people.
Okay.
Not for the ones who are doing the gentrifying, but the ones who got gentrified.
Okay.
That we are called to be an aid to the voiceless and those who are the victims of inhumane treatment. That in many ways we are dealing with a theological issue, but we're also dealing with the ethics of relating to other human beings. And would you want this to happen to you from another human being? We are not taught in our churches to raise that question when it comes to racial mistreatment. We are not taught to raise that question when it comes to gender mistreatment. And we're not even taught to raise that question even when it comes to poor whites themselves, who one could argue are the biggest victims in this entire process because they can't even obtain wealth with their white skin. That if you are
unless they live, unless they live in a black community or Hispanic brown community,
right?
Yeah,
they're the ones.
Then they find their place, right?
They're the ones who are really on an island. I'm amongst these people who have been doing this oppression for 300 years, and I still can't find my wealthy place in it. And so in that sense, one could argue that they have been exploited the most. But the reality is that we're not taught to raise those questions because in this country, nothing trumps, no pun intended, white economic gain. No matter how ruthless you have to be, no matter how conniving you have to be, no matter how deceptive you have to be, no matter how unfair you have to be, that America from its inception has always been interested primarily in one reality, and that is incomparable economic gain for white males. In fact, the slave trade itself, of which we still haven't gotten reparations yet, 244 years of chattel racial slavery, and we've yet to be paid by this country for it. We built the White House, we built the Capitol building,
our streets,
and by the way, we were enslaved because we were artisans who knew how to build. That we weren't just in a dark continent in Africa swinging on vines with bones hanging out of nose. We were selected because of geographic location and because we were skilled artisans, which is also the truth that doesn't come out in public discourse. And so in that sense, that theology then is the medium by which this conversation is broached. And so in that sense, it's a courageous conversation.
Because my mind just thought that's challenging. Right?
Yeah, it could be a death-like conversation as well. It was a death-like conversation for Jesus. It was a death-like reality for Jesus. It was death-like reality for Martin Luther King. It was death-like reality for Malcolm X.
Okay, so I got a question. Because even in this conversation, as we talk about oppression, that's people stuff, right? I am convicted and convinced that this faith that we talk about is relational. It's we talk about the biggest sin is when I mistreat my brother and my sister. When I treat them less than human. When there is no equity, you out in the streets, and I'm
with direct intentionality.
Yeah. What about though? And is there a trump? Is it a matter of it's both and? There are many who would come to the faith who would say, all of that's relevant. I'm concerned. There is a place for that. And certainly we're called to be. When I say I don't think there ever be real equity as long as we have the diverse races, right? And that's the thing of beauty, but it also has its own implications in terms of probably what will be. My mind. But what about those who will say, I understand all of that, my heart bleeds, but I'm living right because I want to get to heaven. Right? So my primary concern becomes living right so I can get to heaven.
And not go to hell.
And not go to hell. Doing what God wants me to do to get to heaven. And somewhere there is a dichotomy, there's that something that I don't know, maybe it's pitting relational towards getting to heaven. So one supersedes the other. Is there somewhere a balance that I like? Was it Tubman Wheatley? I'm not free till all of my people are free.
I am because we are.
Yeah. Is there something to be said about this thing we call faith, about our faith, about our Christian faith, that I want to go to heaven. I want to see the streets paved with gold and all that stuff, right? That we talk about. But at the same time, I'm concerned about how we see Jesus here. I'm concerned about how we theologize about Jesus, because theology is going to be how we frame it. So we do theology and we don't know what it is sometimes, but it's how we frame.
Exactly. We do it more often than we think.
Yeah. Yes. This person called Jesus, right? And if we truly understand that all that you've talked about in terms of a liberation theology that speaks to the conditions of the oppressed, right? And that seeks to liberate, that will give true freedom. Right? I thought, with all of that, is one more important is my getting to heaven more important than how I treat humanity here? I don't, certainly, I ain't ready to go today. My God relationship is great. My prayer life is great. But one day, I'd like to go to this place called heaven, see what it's like. And the but is not a but about getting to heaven, and maybe it is. Because if I'm going to live in a world, and I'm going to be so busy trying to get to heaven, and I forsake the plight of the oppressed, and sometimes maybe even contribute to it.
You go to hell.
Is that where you go? So then is it saying, and I know you said tongue in cheek, but is there something about this gospel, this Bible, these theologies that speaks to people in contexts, right? Cultural context and all others, right? That ought to say something. Help me with I want to get to heaven, and your black theology, so I put it on you, right? Your black theology that says it's theology of the oppressed, and somewhere there's an imbalance. Is there truly one? Is one more?
Well, it's an intentional imbalance, because the way Christianity has been taught to us is not to connect what is required to go to heaven with human oppression, with collective forms of human domination, or struggling against collective suffering. Okay. So of all of our theological categories of reflection, the notion of going to heaven has been the one that's been ideologically manipulated the most.
Say more.
Heaven has a real history on earth. theologically. Beyond teaching slaves that black skin was a sign of demonic, the second teaching of white Christian ministers to the slaves was that if you are a good slave, when you're here, let us know about insurrections from your people. Even go to auction sometimes and bring back some slaves. Let us be able to trust you. And that's where the whole notion of you do your master's bidding when you're selling out, the larger struggle of black people comes from. That slave master actually had so much trust in overseers that he would send them to auction sometime. And so from plantation life even to today, there is no other category of theological reflection in Christianity that's talked about more than going to heaven. And from an even more deeply and a more acutely ideologically manipulative standpoint, all of the criteria is rooted in the religious individual life. None of it is rooted in the collective realm of human domination. Now, this serves two purposes. It serves as a clever ruse to divert black people's attention away from going to heaven while struggling for justice. And at the same time, it affirms white Christian ministers' assertion that going to heaven has less to do with their oppression of black people, and it assuages their guilty conscience. So if there is the remotest possibility that my being a racist, being a slaveholder, and being a Christian bars me from going to heaven and instead going to hell, it won't be a part of the conversation. Okay. And so that's why the conversation is always important, because it is the conversation that gives vent to the language. Okay. And then the language gives vent to the approach. And the approach gives vent to the creation of a systematic theology. Okay. And so in light of that, there is an imbalance. But everything that we do theologically in our context is imbalanced. Okay. You have racism, you have sexism, you have homophobia, you have classism. And at the same time, we have been taught traditionally that the Bible and Christianity says nothing about your condition. That's the imbalance. That's where liberation theology comes in. It comes in to bring that balance and to say, no, it does have everything to do. The Bible has everything to do about these experiences we're having. Because, if earth was not important, that heaven was only important, I don't think God would have called Moses to free the Israelites from slavery in history. I don't think that God would have incarnated God's self in Jesus and incarnated God's self to a poor and despised people. God could have incarnated God's self at any time in the evolving of human history, any geographic location, and certainly to any people. Why would God's self choose not the aristocracy in England or the aristocracy of first century Palestine, or whenever God decided to incarnate God's self? Why did God not incarnate God's self to the community of the wealthy that produced a brutal dictator and is maiming and killing and imprisoning and oppressing his people? God decided to incarnate God's self to the people who were experiencing that suffering, so that God could fully identify with that suffering and fully identify with it as a human being, to take on that suffering, to identify with them that closely as they sought freedom and self-determination from that suffering. That means that heaven may be important, but the earth is important to God. Okay. And it's important enough to God to realize, to bring about that balance, as we were all created in freedom, to bring about that freedom in history and not beyond. But when you look at an Orthodox theology's understanding of heaven and teaching of heaven as something you can only achieve after physical death, and more importantly, only through individualistic gestures, it's clearly a ruse designed to create and perpetuate this imbalance, as you call it, so that white men will continue to benefit, and particularly economically, from the results.
Okay. For about 3 or 4 minutes there, you kind of mixed your theology with some preaching, brother.
Well, the two do have a kindred relationship with each other.
They do, yeah.
Yeah.
Are we okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Before we wrap up, you have stated a few times, at least in my hearing, the lecture today, even in this time that we've shared, the relevancy, the significance, the importance of liberation theology today. You mentioned 47. Lord have mercy. And it's also interesting that we can talk about 40, 47, but now he got there. Some folk voted for him. A whole lot of folk.
That's scandal. And
a whole lot of folk who would fit into your theological framework of the oppressed. May not see themselves as oppressed. You know, sometimes when we make $25, we can go certain places, we ain't poor no more.
Always shuts us up. That's the attempt.
And somewhere, you know,
shut us up.
You can be doctor, whatever you are. At some point, somebody will remind you. Right?
Yeah, they will.
So in this present age, with 47 in place, looking at. And we understand that liberation theology is not just African American. It's Latin American. It's womanist. It's even some from the oppressive states coming out of I believe some of the Jewish conditions in Europe, Germany, Holocaust pieces. So that liberation theology speaks to context in a variety. In diverse places and ways, right?
Absolutely.
For us, if we talk about liberation theology and zeroing in on a black theology, what's the relevance for us today, and why is it that we need to become more aware of the place of black theology? Where are we, and how will it help us move forward?
Well, hopefully, that recent events may end up, whether fortunate or unfortunate, making my job easier.
What do you mean?
Namely because we have seen the same kind of resurgence of the same kind of nastiness in terms of racial antagonisms that we saw in the 60s and the 50s. Public pronouncements, the emergence of white nationalists and terrorist organizations marching. Ku Klux Klan marched in Washington Monday. Even for white people, that's considered racist. Okay. And so liberation theology is needed now more than ever, namely because we're coming out of an era of covert racism. We don't see the signs anymore.
It's back to being over again.
But now you're starting to see a resurgence of overt racism. And so in that sense, we're beginning to see the manifestation again of the mean-spiritedness of humanity's inhumanity to humanity. And I don't know of any other approach to Christian faith that can make any inroads in changing that reality than liberation theology. Namely because it possesses not only the historic analysis of racism in our context, but also it possesses the biblical and salvific tools and approach to see the resurgence of racism itself and to label it properly as ungodly behavior. And is this how you want to be remembered? That you can begin to talk about it in salvific terms now. And say, do you think being this mean-spirited toward immigrants and black people and that somehow this is going to get you into heaven? But more importantly, is it going to achieve a peaceful world going forward? That you can't fall back on the fear of a Browning America or the fear of your lack of supremacy, of your fear of calling the shots in every major decision in the life of this nation and in many ways in this world? Are you going to fall back on that fear? Or are you, as true Christians, going to face the God of Jesus Christ, who calls you to be a voice for the people whom you are denigrating, not to engage in denigrating activity, and at the same time proudly say that this is a Christian nation? You can't have both. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and mammon. You're going to either have to choose the God of Jesus Christ, or you're going to continue to choose white supremacy.
Okay. And what I'm hearing just in those words that you just said in this moment, as we look at liberation theology, it's not sought to be divisive. It's sought to bring us together, to create a unity, a bond out of a true love and a true faith. But in order to get there, we've also got to look at the truths that are before us. We've got to look at those truths, and we've got to look at it contextually, where we are as a people. And it's not misappropriating the word, but also using that scripture to theologize where we are, so that we have a good framework to address our present issues and needs and concerns.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It calls on us to organize under the common banner of struggle. And that's where the universalism come in. You can be white, you know. You could be white and come from a wealthy home. But if you identify, as we saw some white ministers and some white people participate in the civil rights movement, that you can see the truth of the condition and the truth of your place in the current situation racially, and say, I'm going to make, in the aha moment, a conscious decision to join with my black brothers and sisters in the struggle for their freedom and self-determination. That is the universal imperative of the gospel. Not God serving all of us where we are, but making a theological commitment to change if you were someone. And we only look at, we only need to look at, Paul himself, who was the biggest persecutor of Christians of them all. But Paul could not serve both the people of God and be a persecutor of the people of God and the people that God has chosen. He had to make a choice, and he had his Damascus Road experience and made that choice. And so, that is a prime example of how a biblical narrative can be interpreted in the context of liberation theology. That even for people who have benefited for generations from white supremacy, that they can have the aha moment and can say that I can join with my black brothers, sisters, my brown brothers, sisters under the banner of common human struggle and human decency. That it is not right, even in the attempt to try to gain a presidency from a political standpoint, to accuse people of stealing pet dogs from white people and eating them, and then to refer to jobs that black people have held traditionally, particularly black men, as black jobs. And so in that sense, people who realize that could potentially have an aha moment and decide to engage, to ground themselves in the struggle for solidarity.
And that's for the courageousness of our faith steps up, right? And I guess Muffy will always be in my mind. All right, she doesn't know it, and I tell the story and I laugh. But it's that very thing, right? If you know it but don't seek to do anything about it.
Yes.
Hence is the problem.
That's the problem.
But if you know it, you recognize it, and you're willing to say, okay, I need to make a change here.
Yes.
So that we all will be better. Then you got it.
Then you got the truth. That's why Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Free to engage in struggle. Free to assume the struggle. Because the truth is not static. It's an organic phenomenon. And so it compels you, once you have inherited that truth and you have internalized that truth for what it really is, which makes it the truth, then it causes you to make a decision that doesn't fit the theology of the world, but fits the theology of the God of Jesus Christ. And that's what Jesus was trying to tell us with his ministry.
Okay.
That I don't want you to look at my skin color and then we turn around and make him white to perpetuate a racially superior relationship between white and black people. That is used in Jesus in the most ungodly way possible. And so at some point in time, repentance has to figure into the racial situation as well, and redemption has to figure into the racial situation as well, for appropriating sources of Christian faith themselves to justify and legitimate a superior relationship racially.
Okay. So then as we talk about liberation theology, it's transformative. It ought to be transformative. It ought to call us to change and call us to, I'm going to use the word, higher level of being. Calls us to build those right relationships, not just with my God, but how can you love me, right?
Yeah, the transformation of being our godly selves.
Yeah.
Our true godly selves.
If I can't treat y'all good, if I can, how can I really be good to God, right?
Creation itself.
Yeah. So
we're created in freedom.
Yeah.
We're created to be free. And so it's a return to our godly selves.
So then it's transformative. And if we can understand it, if we can get beyond some of our constructs that we were taught growing up from childhood in our diverse places, then perhaps through liberation theology, we can engage in we will see some transformation.
Absolutely.
That really calls us to be people of God.
Yes.
In a unified and in a universal kind of way. That's all inclusive.
Absolutely. Yes. And then we can truly be all inclusive, because God then would truly be no respect of persons.
Okay.
As we say in the Bible.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I want to thank you, man.
Yeah, man.
This has been enlightening. I'm going to pray that for our viewers, that something has been said, that as we look at theology, as we look at what Jesus wants us to do, to understand theologies, to understand some very basic things about the things we say we believe in. Right? Exactly. Because if we know the people, we know the characters, we know the places, but we miss the theological messages there for us.
Absolutely.
We miss some of the things that keep it from being authentic. Right?
Absolutely.
We continue to miss the boat.
Yes.
I'm prone that we don't live in a hopeless world. It's full of hope, because of the God we serve.
And the task of the theologian is to separate the inauthentic from the authentic, to separate, as the Bible says, the wheat from the chaff. One of my favorite analogies from the Bible.
Okay, so sometimes maybe we all even ought to engage in some theology.
Yeah, at some point.
Just to help us.
And make and call it theology in which we're engaging.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we know what we're doing.
We know what we're doing.
And we're able to label, because when I can label, I can identify.
Absolutely.
And when I can truly identify, then we can make some changes. Yeah.
Absolutely. And as you said, that will take courage. It really will. Because once we're creatures of habit as human beings. And once you've been doing something, not just for 2 years, but when you have been doing something for 250, 300 years, it's hard to unlearn that moving forward, because you're dealing with not only your contemporary situation, but you're dealing with historic DNA that you've inherited from other black people. Whites are dealing with the historic DNA that they inherited from their slave master great-grandfathers and the anti-black animals that came with it. And so it's hard when you've been doing something the same way for so long to change.
It is.
But it is what the God of Jesus Christ calls us to. It calls us to change. Pharaoh, you don't need to get a hardened heart. You need to change, because these people are leaving Egypt tonight and they're going to freedom.
And I was going to toss in, and even some of the folks who think they got it all together, haven't understood some things, and need to engage in some of the theologies.
Absolutely.
So they can really become even more authentic. I won't say they're not authentic, but certainly the understanding where lives will be transformed.
Yes.
We want to get to heaven.
Yes.
But we also need lives transformed right here on earth.
And of course, not only from a conversion standpoint, but from an aha standpoint. Yeah.
And then we ought to always be growing in our faith, right? It's not stagnant. It's not something that I get to a point and now I got it all.
We all work.
But we ought to always be evolving.
Yeah. Be leery of know-it-alls.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm glad you're here, man. And again, I want you all to help me thank Dr. Harry Hank Singleton, and I encourage you. I cannot vouch. I have not read one of these yet. I didn't buy this one. I bought these two and that one, and I am going to read them. I have engaged in some Liberation Theology, Black theology. Believe in it. Believe that it's vital to who we are as a people. As a Black people, yes. Some things we need to know contextually about ourselves and about how we see ourselves from that book we call Bible, right? So I want to encourage you as we look at theology, that you go out and take a gander at Forever Thy Path, the God of Black liberation, white religion and Black humanity. Turn it up, right? Divine revelation and human liberation. Some good reading, some things that will at least get you to start thinking, right? Not advocating that what we do here is end all be all. But if we can get you to begin to think, then we've done a good thing. I'm a believer. I say, God, in the Word it says, I will not have you ignorant, not only of the Word, but as we apply the Word, as we seek to live the Word. We need to come to it with some degree of knowledge and knowing.
Right.
This is a good start. And the other readings out there, he mentioned James Cone. James Cone is amazing. And I'll even say to go way back and pick up a reading from Howard Thurman.
Yes. J.D. Otis Roberts.
Yes.
George Cummings.
Yeah.
Dwight Hopkins.
All right, listen. Did you get all those? If you did, I know he spoke fast, but hopefully we will do this again. Want to thank you, good sir.
Thank you, sir. Of course, those can be purchased from my website. You can click on the book, and it'll send you straight to the published information.
What's your website?
Yes, harrysingleton.com. www.harrysingleton.com.
So you can go to
my web page, and you can order the books directly from my web page. Just click on the cover, and it'll send you to the ordering information. Or some people like to do one-stop shopping, and so they're all available on Amazon as well. You just go to Amazon Books and click in Harry H. Singleton III, or put in Harry H. Singleton III, and they will come up.
Fantastic. All right. So he's giving you the way.
Yes.
So let's move to the point of acting. Go and visit Harry H. Singleton III's website, and let's buy some of his books. Said thank you. Glad you're here, man. Safe travels to you.
Thank you.
As you get out of here tomorrow, heading back to Carolina, right?
Yes.
So praying that the Spirit of God go with you, and that you arrive safely, and that you dive in and have fun. Thank you all for sharing with us on this evening. Praying that you were spurred to begin to think about how you contextualize your faith, to think about liberation theology, and more specifically, Black theology, how it impacts us as a nation, and how it indeed can serve as a tool of liberation that is also transformative, not just for Black folk, but transformative for a community of people. Hope that you found something helpful this evening. Hope that you will join us next week as we come back to you, and as we engage in conversations and we ask the question, what's up with that? Until next time, God bless.